Let's go back and redraft the first 15 picks of fantasy football drafts this year. This is going to be a fun little exercise where we go back and do a reevaluation of the first half of the season, but also do a little forecasting into the second half of the season as well. We're going to go around. There's 3 of us. We're each going to make 5 picks of who we think the first 15 picks should be. It'll go Cameron, Tyler, and then myself. We'll wrap back around to Cameron and redraft the first 15 picks of fantasy football drafts this year. So Cameron, I'll have you kick us off here. The 101 this year, I feel like is probably consensus between the 3 of us, but I'm open to you surprising us.
I think some people might think it's Derrick Henry here, but I'm going Saquon Barkley.
Really?
And it is because right now, I know Derrick Henry's been on fire. I know he's been awesome. If we're just talking first half of the season, it's Derrick Henry. I'm not even considering, right? 950 yards, 9 touchdowns already. But Barkley averaging 1.3 fantasy points per game less than him. Barkley, 4th easiest schedule rest of season. Derrick Henry, hardest schedule rest of season. I understand, right? Derrick Henry feels matchup proof at this point, but Saquon has been just as good, averaging 6 yards per carry. He's seeing just a little bit more receiving work than Derrick Henry is, where I feel a little bit more comfortable if he has a game where he doesn't score a touchdown. Obviously, worries you a little bit with Jalen Hurts scoring 3 touchdowns this last week. But Barkley has been amazing thus far. He's looked awesome. I think this Eagles team is, starting to get back on track offensively. And just with the schedule that he has to finish out the year, his playoff schedule is Carolina, Pittsburgh, Washington, Dallas. I think he's going to put up a lot of points in those games. I think you're going to want him in the playoffs. So I think Saquon Barkley finishes as the number 1 overall running back at the end of the season.
So this is where it gets fascinating, right? Where it's like, to me, my 101 would have been Derrick Henry. Ty, is that who your 101 would have been as well? You don't have to spoil it. You can say no. Okay. All right. No. So that's interesting. So we all would have had different 101s here, which I think goes to show when we're also factoring rest of season into it as well. I think you make a very compelling point there, Cameron, if he's got a fantastic schedule rest of season, like there is totally a world where Saquon Barkley outperforms Derrick Henry rest of season. And if you think the difference is marginal between the first half of the season versus what we get in the second half of the season, then it's probably worth picking Saquon Barkley ahead of Derrick Henry with what we know today. Ty, I'll pivot right to you because if your 101 wouldn't have been Derrick Henry, I'm curious who yours would have been because clearly this is going to be your pick then.
Yeah, Ceedee Lamb. And some people may call this recency bias. Some people may be too scared off by what happened in the first half of the year, and I completely get it. But for me, I'm not saying that this second half of the season is going to be a 1-for-1 of what we saw last year, but this was the number 1 overall player in fantasy football the second half of the season, averaging 28.5 fantasy points. I don't think we're going to see 28.5 again this year. But when I look at this Dallas team, there is no run game. Ceedee Lamb is the entire offense here. And he does have a nice schedule. I also probably wouldn't have cared if it was a difficult schedule, just because I think that Dak and CD connection is matchup proof. Again, I'm going to chase here the number 1 overall player the rest of the season. I get Derrick Henry may have the positional, argument as well here, but like I said, I'm chasing that number 1 overall player the rest of the season.
Cameron, how far was Ceedee Lamb down your board? Admittedly, Ceedee Lamb was down a bit for me.
He was 7th, and so I understand thinking about it. Right, if you're looking projection right now, because CD 18.9 PPR points per game, wide receiver 4. He's been good. Obviously, that's carried by scoring 36 or whatever it was last night, or I guess 2 nights ago now when you guys are listening to it. But if, like Ty said, it feels like, it might just be confirmation bias that he comes off the bye and puts up the wide receiver 1 week after what we saw last season. He was drafted the 101 for a reason. So I'm okay sticking with your guns here. I don't think it's like a dumb pick or anything, right? I don't think it's like, oh, Ty's just making this up. No, he's been good enough at this far. And we know kind of the trajectory he was on last year, and we're already kind of seeing it this year. So I don't hate it, but yeah, he was my 7th overall pick.
Yeah, Ceedee Lamb was 8th on my board, but I think you could have made a case for him to be 6th or 7th as well. But again, I'm with you. I think there's a case to be made for chasing Ceedee Lamb here. But I'll take the low-hanging fruit that's left since I've already outed Derrick Henry as my first overall pick that would have been in this draft. I will take Derrick Henry. I mean, we know the stretch that he was on between weeks 3 and 7. He scored 25 plus fantasy points in 4 of those 5 games. I mean, this is a guy who is still getting 25, 24, 24 totes per game. He's scoring in almost every single game. And I get it. You look at the rest of season schedule. I mean, weeks 11 through 13 before the bye, you get Pittsburgh, the Chargers, the Eagles. Then even in the fantasy playoffs, you get the Pittsburgh, or you get the Steelers, the Texans. If you play through week 18, you get the Browns as well. Those aren't matchups you're necessarily targeting. But, when I get the guy who is very clearly the number 1 overall running back in fantasy football through the first 8 weeks, and the number 3 player overall who's outscoring quarterbacks, like the only players outscoring Derrick Henry, I'm going to correct myself. I know one of them is Baker Mayfield, which is just like mind-blowing that Baker Mayfield is one of those players. And it's Lamar Jackson, who is the other one. So, I'm just going to go ahead and stick to my guns here and go with Derrick Henry with the 3rd pick here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the right pick as far as like he had to be in these top 3 for sure. I like I said, I understand Ty's pick. I understand where it's coming from. I felt like he should be top 2. I had them 1A, 1B. I just went Saquon because of the rest of the season schedule. But what he's done so far, the way they look offensively, it's really hard to see them slowing down even with the toughest schedule rest of the season.
So Ty, where was Derrick Henry at on your list then if Ceedee Lamb was at the top?
2.
Okay, so he was at 2. So consensus for all of us.
Yeah,
he was the top 3 pick. You're gonna you wouldn't have regretted taking Derrick Henry 1st or 2nd overall in your draft this year. You would have gotten a massive payout. I'll come right back to you, Cameron. Who is the 4th pick for you?
I surprised myself a little bit when I made these rankings, but it's Kyren Williams. And I thought of Kamara here. I thought of Jahmyr Chase. I don't want to spoil who's going to come next for you guys, but I'm going Kyren Williams. And the biggest reason for me is his low on the season in PPR formats is 14.4 points. But we've also seen him put up 31, multiple games over 20. So he's a guy with an extremely high floor. And then we saw last week, Puka came back in a big way against Minnesota. Cooper Kupp looked pretty good. And Kyren Williams still had 23 rushes for 97 yards against a Minnesota team who admittedly has not looked as good defensively, these last 2 weeks, but their strength of their defense was supposed to be stopping the run. And Kyren, was able to run all over them. They just kept pounding the run. He's seen 24, 19, 22, 21, and 23 rush attempts in his last 5 weeks. And I think they're just going to continue to feed him rest of the season. They got a great top 8 easiest running back schedule rest of the season. I think they're just going to keep giving him the ball, and he's going to be the focal point of that offense. And with that volume and the Rams team that we saw last week and how good they looked offensively, I think he's going to score a lot of touchdowns. So I'm all in on Kyren Williams rest of the season.
Yeah, I have no gripes with Kyren Williams there. I think after Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, there's just this conglomerate of like 4 to 5 players that you could have in any order right here. And I wouldn't disagree with you in any fashion. I did have Kyren Williams down about, I only had him 2 picks lower than this, but again, he's in that conglomerate of players where if you would have thrown on any of these players, I wouldn't have been surprised in the least. Where was Kyren Williams at for you, Ty?
He was pick number 8 for me. And I think it was because you've got Cooper Kupp and you've got Puka coming back into the mix. Now, that's not just, we've said when offenses are at full strength, like you do kind of have to, you can't like take away from Kyren because of Puka and Cooper Kupp being back. But I'm just worried now how much they're going to need Kyren at this point. Like he was their offense when both receivers were out and stuff. He still can be. This offense can still be built on the run. I just think for some of the other running backs that we haven't talked about just yet, I might be a little more intrigued by just because of guarantee role, I'll call it, in their offense.
I mean, we saw both Kupp and Nacua come back last year when they were all on the field. They were all absolute studs. I mean, they were all top 10 options at the position. And Kyren was a top 3 option at the running back position specifically. So I think that's where I'm like not quite as concerned, but also this isn't the same offensive line. I think it is a possibility that they don't need to lean on Kyren as much, but I get where you're coming from in that regard, but I don't mind Kyren Williams with the 4th pick there. Ty, before we get to your pick, though, we got to make sure we talk to the 93% out there who are watching this video and aren't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel. First and foremost, we appreciate the 7% of you who are subscribed, tune in and watch every single week. But if you're part of the 93%, there's even some of you out there where you're like, honestly, I didn't even know I was subscribed. I just watch your content every week. Totally forgiven, but just make sure you move that mouse button really, really quick. Click that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell as well, so you know when all of our newest episodes are up. We still got trade targets coming for you all this week. We still got start sits at the end of the week, but we're really going to start mixing up this early week episode. Some second half league winners, some rest of season rankings. We're going to have a little bit of fun along the way. So make sure you're subscribed and turn on those notifications for all of our newest content. Ty, to you for the 5th overall pick, who is it on your board?
This is Jahmyr Chase for me. The second best, because again, for this kind of redrafting that we're doing, it's what we know now. Where are we taking these guys? For Jahmyr Chase, it was rough the first couple weeks. Since T. Higgins has come back into this offense, Jahmyr Chase has absolutely taken off. He's gotten a game with 29 points, 41, and then he's mixed in 17, 17, 12, and 20. With Jahmyr Chase, you're getting some absolute crazy boom weeks while still maintaining a good enough floor where it's not completely, where the floor is completely falling out from underneath. And the biggest question for Jahmyr coming into the season was really, how is Joe Burrow going to look? How is the risk going to hold up? Joe Burrow has looked great. That has not been an issue at all this year. We tried to make a headline out of it after week 1, like he couldn't grab a water bottle. Did you guys see that? Like that got blown so out of proportion. Like Jahmyr Chase is a stud. He was absolutely worth a top 5 pick at the beginning of the season, and he should still be a top 5 pick at this point too.
Yeah, Jahmyr Chase is the 7th highest scoring player in fantasy football this year. He is the 3rd highest scoring non-quarterback player. There is no debate around this pick. I think this is a perfectly acceptable pick in this range. Admittedly, I had 2 other players ahead of Jahmyr Chase. Is this about where Jahmyr Chase was for you, Cameron?
Yes, he was pick 4 for me. So, if Kyren had already gone, I would have taken him here. Like I said, since week 3, he's been awesome. He's averaging 23.1 PPR points per game, which is the most out of any non-quarterback. 2.5 points more than the next closest wide receiver, which was Nico Collins. And I just see this offense just looks like it's going to get better the rest of the season. So yeah, I think as far as wide receivers go, he's my wide receiver 1 on the board.
And I should clarify, Jahmyr Chase was my 4th pick on my board. So I'm 100% in agreement here with this pick. I'm just saying there's 2 guys that I even had ranked ahead of Jahmyr Chase that actually haven't been taken yet. And I think
interesting.
I think I'm going to surprise people with this one. And I'm going to be fascinated to get your 2 thoughts on this as well. Pick number 6 for me would be Alvin Kamara. Oh, yeah. I think it's indisputable, obviously, how good he's been this year. He is the running back 2 in PPR formats behind Derrick Henry. He is the 5th highest scoring player in fantasy football this year. You look at 22 points in week 1. Obviously, 44 points is going to elevate you quite a bit in week 2, but even still, 15.7, 24.9, 12.6, 17.4. You get his first single-digit week came in week 7, then still had 18.2 in week 8. Now, I know it's easy to look at this offense and think, gross, really? Spencer Rattler at the helm? The reality is that we're going to get Derek Carr back. You don't have Rashid Shaheed anymore. Chris Olave is back and got his volume, but that's what this offense is going to be. It's going to be Alvin Kamara and Chris Olave. And you look at Kamara's rest of season schedule. He gets Carolina here in week 9. Atlanta and Cleveland before their week 12 bye is, less than ideal. But after the bye, like when we're talking about league winning stretches, I think this has to be a consideration for. He gets the Rams, the Giants, the Commanders, the Packers, and the Raiders in weeks 13 through 17. All I need is for Kamara to catch about 4 or 5 passes, go for about 30, 40 yards in weeks 10 and 11, against Atlanta and Cleveland, just to maintain that, 13, 14, 15 point value. And once I'm looking rest of the season, that there is 17 to 20 point upside there every week for Kamara rest of season. So part of this is look at how good he's been at the start of the season, but also he's going to be plenty involved with Derek Carr returning at quarterback soon for this offense. So that's where I have Alvin Kamara. I actually had Alvin Kamara as my second highest ranked player coming into this, which is going to be high and spicy for some people, but I think most people would say, he probably does fall between that 6 and 8 range.
Yeah, I had him at 8, and that's just, I did knock him because a fourth of his fantasy points have come from one game where he put up 4 touchdowns.
Totally.
We just haven't seen him be the same touchdown guy over the last couple of years. That's the only reason I knocked him, because, like you said, you can't say, because you take out that game, he's averaging 17 fantasy points per game otherwise, which would be the running back 10. You can't say, okay, well, he's a running back 10 then. That is unfair, because he does have that, in his repertoire. For me, the concerning thing was, I don't think we're going to get another game like that, because I don't think this Saints team as a whole looks anything like they did the first 2 weeks. Obviously, reception numbers have been nuts, but I also think the rushing floor is so low for Kamara. Like, we've seen 11 for 26, 13 for 40, 7 for 10, that it just is a little more concerning, where when we're talking top 10 players in fantasy football, those little nitpicky things for me just dock someone. So that's why I moved Kamara down. But again, I don't fault you for taking him there, because the receiving work alone is unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, when he's seeing 9, 8, 8, 7, and 11, he's a wide receiver. Like he's drawing more targets per game than most top 10 wide receivers in the league right now. So that's what it comes down to for me. And I know it's significantly less yardage, but if you're a running back getting that kind of volume in PPR formats, to me, you have to be a top 5 pick. But again, you have him at 6, or you had him at 8, excuse me, and even docked him a little bit just because, the first 2 games were against Carolina and Dallas. Where was he for you, Ty?
He's at 9 for me, partially because of what you had pointed out, Cam, about just the beginning of the season was so great. You still have to acknowledge that the receiving numbers, again, are just phenomenal. The other part of this too is the offensive line play for New Orleans has been in such a flux this year between injuries and rotations. He's worked through those in fantasy production. The other part of this too, in the weirdest way possible, Alvin Kamara's ceiling depends on Derek Carr. And that is the craziest sentence in my mind, that we need Derek Carr to improve his outlook.
Right.
But that's truly just how this Saints offense is built. So I completely understand why you took him where you did and how high you have him ranked. I just also have some other question marks about Kamara rest of the season.
Which is entirely fair. I feel like Kamara is one of those guys you're either heck yeah, dude, he's been so good and I'm going to take that early season production. And I'm looking towards the rest of the season. It probably, the rushing numbers may not get better, but Derek Carr has to make this situation better. So I'm willing to take what I get in the first half of the season, take this, do you even want to call it concerning-ish when, he's still giving you 17.5 and 18.2 into the last, you know what I mean? Right? It totally depends on how you want to weigh those out. So if you want to dock Kamara more because of that, I completely understand. For me, I'm just going to take my lumps there. And I'm looking at the rest of the season. We could be getting potentially the overall running back 1 rest of season is not out of the range of outcomes for Alvin Kamara with the receiving work he gets and the schedule that he gets in my mind as well. Cam, I'll come right back to you here. 7th pick now out of the top 15 picks. Who is it for you?
Yeah, I still, like you said, for yours, I still got 2 guys on my board that would have gone before this. Yep. But for me, it's easy here. It's Justin Jefferson. And I think he's making us look silly. We were even talking before the season. I'm still got Justin Jefferson, as a top 4 wide receiver. I don't quite have him that Ceedee Tyreek tier. And he's going, it doesn't matter who my quarterback is. I'm the best wide receiver in the NFL, or, whatever, if you want to say, have that NFL argument, but at least, I think he's top 2 personally, and I don't think he's 2, but so far this season, his game logs 15.9, 23.3, 20.1, 20.5, 15.2, 21.4, and 19.5. That's what he's put up from a fantasy perspective. We talked about with Kyren, the floor is so incredibly high. Same thing with Jefferson. You have not had a week yet where you're like, man, that stunk. His worst weekly finish is the wide receiver 21.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that all day long, and I'm going to be extremely happy about it. I don't see this team necessarily slowing down rest of the season when it comes to Jefferson. Kevin O'Connell calls him open more than I think I've ever seen an elite wide receiver get called, have plays called for them to get them in the flow of the game. So yeah, I'm still all in on Justin Jefferson, and I think 7, is as low as I'd let him slide in this draft.
Oh, I wouldn't have. I shouldn't have let him get past like 6. I probably should have taken him ahead of Kamara there because for me he was number 3 on my board. I had my top 3 was Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, and Justin Jefferson. With Saquon Barkley then coming afterwards and Ja'Marr Chase after that. So yeah, this is a no-brainer. I mean, at the beginning of the season, people were saying, what if we're just overthinking this whole Sam Darnold thing? Like, what if it doesn't matter? And you would get people who are just like, I don't know, Sam Darnold, look at the course of his NFL career. And it's like, really? Like, we're saying that about Sam Darnold when Nick Mullins, who hasn't had a starting gig in the NFL, outside of being a career backup, really? We're concerned about Sam Darnold? I mean, you're 100% right. For anybody who had question marks around Justin Jefferson, it just looks absolutely silly right now. How high was he for you, Ty? Did we let him slide too far here? Was it just like we just got let personal preference get in the way and we really should have just taken him like 4th or 5th in this draft?
Yeah, probably. He was number 5 for me. Because it honestly has just been the quietest 92 yards per game kind of season I've ever seen from a wide receiver. Again, the lowest fantasy points he's had in a game, 15.2, which is great. The only reason why he's not being talked about more is because he hasn't topped 23.3 fantasy points. So people are expecting more of Jefferson. So I'm just going to say this, like the expectation for Jefferson is 22 points a game. I mean, like, come on now, because again, this is how he's been performing this year and producing in fantasy is to what everyone expects from Justin Jefferson. So again, it's quiet, but it's because he's been producing so well this year.
Yeah, he has not given you a single week in single digit fantasy points while he is still averaging nearly 20 or 19 and a half, fantasy points per game on the season. I think we've gotten a lot of the big, probably obvious names out of the way here. I feel like for most people, that would be a very clear consensus top 7-ish players. You might be able to mix in another player or 2. So who are you going to go with next year, Ty, at pick number
8? Probably my running back 1 for the rest of the year, Ken Walker.
Yes. Yes. I love this pick so much. He was next on my board too.
Okay.
I was in a very, oh boy, we'll get to you, sir, in just a second.
No.
But for me, it was either Jefferson or Ken Walker here. And so you made my decision easy in going Ken Walker since you took Jefferson. But the fact is, yeah, like the 2 missed games at the beginning of the year could drop Ken Walker in the rankings. Like if you knew he was going to miss 2 games, he wouldn't be, probably going this high. But the fact is, the dude is getting he's been the running back 3 in usage this year. And you're combining how do I say this? One of the most dynamic rushers in the league. And now he's getting a receiving role in the Seattle offense. Yeah. Like it was reported at the beginning of the season. Most people were like, well, he never really got utilized in the receiving game in college. So is it really going to happen? Yeah. Cam raised his hand.
I'll call myself for that.
Me too. Right. Yeah. No, I'll own up to that too.
Yeah. Again, running back 3 in usage. He had a game with 33, 20, 23, 18. Now, the reason why he probably is going this late and not earlier in this redraft is because he does have games where he's only gotten 5 carries and 9 carries, and he can't even get over 20 yards in those kind of games. So with the volatility in the rushing work, I understand not putting him higher, but I feel like this is kind of the sweet spot because, again, dynamic rusher with a great receiving workload, like, yeah, it makes too much sense for me.
So what's crazy about Ken Walker is that, I mean, he also has 2 missed games this year. That's why he's this low for me. If he didn't miss any games this year, I mean, we're talking about him as probably, assuming he's producing at the same level that he has been, we're talking about top 3, 4 pick rest of season probably. But, you have to factor in, okay, well, he missed 2 games at the start of the season. But I'm looking down at the list of other guys who have missed time this year. And Kenneth Walker's just head and shoulders ahead of them for me because of how much value he's giving you at the running back position and what he's now, like you said, doing in the receiving game. I mean, you look at his game log, it is 5, 8, 8, 2 in week 7, but then another 5 targets here in week 8. How high was he for you? Cameron, you had a little bit of adversity here. So where was Ken Walker for you? And how shocking was this pick for you? That feels like a little bit of an overstatement to your reaction, but like you had like a little bit of a really kind of a reaction.
So it wasn't shocking, and he was down at 11 for me. So it's not like it was, out of the ballpark. He still would have been a first round pick. I don't think it's terrible. The 2 games I did knock him for. I think that for me is what I pushed him down on. And then also, I'm looking, and like Ty said, you see nine rushes in one game, 5 last game. I think last game did scare me a little bit more. I think that's why I pushed him down, because that Seahawks team just looked so awful.
So bad.
And he just hasn't been an overly efficient runner either this season. He's averaging 4.3 yards per carry. He feels like Kyren Williams with a Zach Charbonnet that's just a little bit more involved than Blake Corum is. That's kind of where I'm at with him right now. Obviously, the receiving work's been phenomenal, but I did knock him for the 2 missed games, and just seeing nine rush attempts and 5 rush attempts in two different games just gave me a little bit where if I was thinking about drafting right now, that moves him to the end of the first round for me.
Yeah, I mean, and his only game with more than 14 rush attempts this year was back in week 1. So it's not like he's getting this Joe Mixon level volume or anything like that. But with the receiving work he's getting, it's making up for those lack of 3 rush attempts every game. Actually, you're probably getting more value from the receiving work he's getting than those 3 additional rush attempts to get him up to that 17, 18 number that you would like to see him at. I will gladly take away 3 carries to add 4 more catches for 20 more yards on top of that, because I'm probably going to get more points out of those receptions than I am those rushes, especially in a PPR league. So, Ty, I'm with you. I love Ken Walker with that pick. Before we get to the 9th pick, though, fellas, let's take a quick break here from the good people over at Underdog, and we'll be right back. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We are through the first 8 picks of our redo of the 2024 Fantasy Football Draft. Thus far, off the board, we have had Saquon Barkley, Ceedee Lamb, Derrick Henry, Kyren Williams, Ja'Marr Chase, Alvin Kamara, Justin Jefferson, and Kenneth Walker. I am now on the clock with pick 9. And this is one where I think this is where it may truly start to get interesting. Because now you're getting into the land of disappointing starts to the season, but also guys who were tearing it up at the beginning of the season, but then missed 2 or 3 games like we just talked about with Ken Walker. I'm going to go with a guy who hasn't missed any time this year, and I'm curious what you two think about this. I am going to go with Bijan Robinson here. And so both of you had a little bit of a interest. Yeah. All right. And this is where I'm coming back to, I did this exercise with myself in my head, right? And I'm thinking, if I was at the beginning of the season, what is the point when is the point that it's unacceptable, or where I would just rather take a 0 on the week than take whatever the player was giving me? And I kind of made that line at if you're giving me less than 9 fantasy points, I may just rather take the 0 and shoot upside at a different position than take a guy who's played the full season, right? But Bijan Robinson hasn't given you any weeks with less than 10 fantasy points. I know it was rough between weeks 3 and 5, where he gave you 13.2, 11.4, 10.7. But when he's given you 23 plus over the last 3 weeks, he now gets Dallas, New Orleans, and Denver coming up. I mean, they're starting to figure it out with Bijan. He's getting plenty of targets as well. I mean, 7 and 5 targets in each of his last 2 games. He's getting at least 3 on the season, only 1 week less than 3. They're starting to, the Atlanta Falcons are starting to figure this out. Bijan has been a top 10 running back in each of the last 3 weeks, top 5 in 2 of the last 3. This is an offense for me that's finally starting to figure it out. Oh, we should just feed our best players? It's why did it take 6 weeks to figure that out? But that's why I'm holding on to optimism here for Bijan Robinson. Is I love the schedule coming up. If he gives you 2 more games, 3 more games, and 20 plus fantasy points, I wouldn't be surprised here. And again, this is just an offense that is figuring it out. I will bet on that for how hot they've been over the last few weeks and how this offense has been clicking. So I get it might not be everybody's cup of tea after the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. I get it. I really do. This is more about what I've been seeing from the Falcons recently and the faith that I have in them rest of season.
Yeah, I still got 2 running backs higher than him. I'll talk
I don't
about
blame
one
you.
of them next. I'll talk about one of them next, but I do understand the hot streak has been good, right? You're finally seeing, hey, this is what we've been talking about for a year and a half about Bijan Robinson. We're finally seeing it. You know, I mean, it helps you got to play Carolina, Seattle, Tampa Bay, but the volume has been there. The receiving work has stayed steady. We're seeing 4, 5, 6 targets a game. You needed that. And like you said, this offense is clicking right now. So if they're clicking, it kind of feels like, hey, let's keep going to Bijan. I just don't know if he can maintain it because Tyler Algier is just enough of a headache. Where I'm just like, is he going to get the touchdowns necessary for him to, you know? And that's what I mean. I'm not saying Tyler Algier is going to make him bad, but if we're talking about a top 9 pick, right, then we can get nitpicky with Tyler Algier scoring 5 or 6 touchdowns the rest of the season. So that is my worry, but I also don't hate it, especially when we project rest of the season.
I was going to say, I will look rest of season. Week 12 bye. I mentioned Dallas, New Orleans, Denver before the bye. Chargers and Minnesota right after the bye. But the fantasy playoffs, Vegas, New York Giants, Washington Commanders. If he's playing to 18, he does get the Carolina Panthers once again. So I'm optimistic there. Where does he fall for you, Ty?
He was my number 6 player overall.
Number 6?
Number 6. Yes.
Wow.
So Bijan to me feels like the Justin Jefferson of running backs in the sense that, like, maybe that's a bad comparison, but I feel like Bijan is not getting talked about enough during this hot streak that he's on. But again, going 16, 16, 13, 11, 10, 25, 23, 22. None of those are exactly like bad performances. We had our moments where we almost talked about Bijan on our trending and ending because we're like, okay, what's going on? You only get 7 carries against New Orleans. Like, what's really going on? And it wasn't so much about Bijan. It was so much about what's going on with the coaching, what's going on with Algier playing as well as he was. I just think for a guy, again, that's average, that's had 25, 23, 22 fantasy points in his last 3 games, putting up 5.2 yards per carry in those games. Like, what else does Bijan exactly need to do? So I think maybe 6 can be a little high because, again, we saw the first 5 weeks of the season not be exactly what you wanted. But at this point, like, I feel like he's all the way here. And now for the rest of the season, like, you can expect good performances from Bijan again.
Yeah. This is about where he fell for me. So this is like, I had him as my 9th player, but I do think there's upside for him to, produce like a top 6 non-quarterback player rest of season. Cameron, I'll come back to you. You've got pick 10 here. You said you had 2 other running backs ahead of Bijan. You wanted to talk about one of them. So go ahead, take your pick.
Yeah, there's actually a different player I want to talk about, but I'm thinking he'll be there at 13. But it's the guy I'm talking about right now is Jahmyr Gibbs. And he finishes outside the top 24 in PPR formats. Only 1 finish outside the top 15 so far this season. It's actually interesting because the receiving work hasn't been as good as we kind of hope for Gibbs. He has 2 games with no receptions, and he has 1 game with 1 reception for 6 yards, which was last week. But he's looked awesome on the ground. Obviously, he scored 20 points last week. He had a 70-yard touchdown, so 13 come from that touchdown. But you're going to have plays like that from him all year long because this Detroit offense is cooking right now.
Yeah.
On another level. They are toying with teams. 2 of the last 3 teams they've played with or played against, Dallas and Tennessee. I mean, they're just running just random plays out of their playbook. They're trying to get Penny Sewell to score touchdowns. Yeah. And I don't see that slowing down, right? And honestly, the fantasy playoffs, weeks 14 to 17, so I'll go week before. You go Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago, San Francisco, which kind of sounds like a little bit of a tougher schedule. But I think that's good for Gibbs because they'll be competitive games, right? That Dallas game, he only had 12 points because it wasn't competitive after the first 6 minutes.
Yeah.
It at least gives them a reason. And this team is good enough where every player on the team is pretty much matchup proof at this point.
Yeah.
They're all going to score no matter what. And we've talked about Laporta multiple times. Yeah, Laporta, Amon-Ra didn't have a great week last week. The two guys that are always going to have a great week are David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. And you know that without a shadow of a doubt because that is this team's identity. So, yeah, I just think he's going to be so unbelievably consistent rest of the season that I think Gibbs is – I don't know. I've been just a fan of Gibbs before he came into the league, and he just carried it through. So maybe that's why I'm a little higher, but I had him as my player 6.
Oh, you did have him at player 6. So this is exactly where I had Jahmyr Gibbs. At this point, we have clipped through my top 10 players, and Gibbs is at number 10 for me. You could make the argument of putting him ahead of Bijan Robinson or any. Frankly, like I don't blame you for having him up at 6 either. Like that's how freaking good he's been, and that's how good this Detroit Lions offense has looked as of recent as well. Where is he at for you, Ty? Is this about where you expected him? Did you have him a little bit lower, or did you have him higher?
Nope, player 11 for me. So right in this spot.
Yeah. There is very little to not like about Jahmyr Gibbs moving forward because this Detroit Lions offense is going to run the ball. That is what they are good at. They're going to smash teams on the ground, no matter how good their run defense is. They're going to run right through you. That's what they want to do. And they're getting back to the basics of this offense of what they're good at. We saw Ben Johnson kind of, flex his muscles a little bit earlier in the season, right? Of like, all right, this guy, Jameson Williams, who we all think I just left for dead, watch me scheme him open. And now it's like, watch, I'm going to go ahead and get offensive line. I'm going to get David Montgomery throwing touchdowns out of the bat, right? Like he's toying with teams, like you said, Cameron, Khalif Raymond scoring. I mean, this Lions team is unbelievable. So yeah, to have Jahmyr Gibbs here, I think is entirely valid. Alrighty, Ty, it's back to you here. Pick number 11. Who's it going to be?
I'm going to rip the Band-Aid off here because now we've reached this group of players of just like, yeah, they either got injured or they played, but they're only putting up like 4 or 5 fantasy points. I'm going to rip the Band-Aid of the injured guys here. I'm going to go Nico Collins.
Okay.
Part of this is, yes, the first 5 games of his season before he got hurt, 27, 33 points, 17 and 12. Those are similar to, those are like Jamar Chase-esque kind of week-to-week numbers. The injury does not help, right? Missing 4 games. It sounds like he's going to be back then for week 10, but the injury does not help. Again, for a great start to a season, the injury definitely derailed things for you. But what keeps him here for me, maybe I'm putting too much weight into this, but Stephon Diggs picking up a non-contact knee injury.
Yeah.
Typically, those are not short-term injuries. Those are typically longer-term. So Nico coming back, again, for how well he was doing at the beginning of the year, where he put up 8, 10, 10, and 15 targets in 4 straight games. For how high his usage is and for how well he had been doing and how the rest of the season looks, I'm willing to put the injury aside here and take him here with this pick.
There is so much nuance around Nico Collins here where I had such a difficult time ranking him. Mm-hmm. And I like looking back, I might have had him ranked too low. But again, I went with this philosophy of how long could I survive early in the season without your production? And Nico just happened to get hurt at like the most like crucial time where it's like you were crushing the first 4 weeks and now I got to miss you for the next 4 to 5 weeks. Like that to me knocked him down far enough. But you're right. Now when you look rest of season and you're probably going to be without Stephon Diggs rest of season, I mean, what's stopping Nico Collins from being the number 1 overall player rest of this, right? Like that is the ceiling. So there is so much nuance here where I don't blame you for ripping off the Band-Aid here. I don't think I would have quite yet, but there's every case in the world why Nico Collins should actually probably be top 10 and not sliding outside of the top 10. How high was he for you, Cameron? Because admittedly, again, I'm going down my list. I had Nico Collins probably too low. He barely cracked my top 15. But where did he end up falling for you?
I had him at 15. And so, I docked him for the 4 games. But at the same time, I understand it. Like even the game he got hurt in, he had 2 targets, 2 receptions in 13% of snaps for 78 yards and a touchdown. He just gives you that upside every single week. The week before that, 15, 12, 151 and a touchdown. And then, like you said, Ty, Stephon Diggs is gone. Tank Dell hasn't been playing very well. Like CJ, we know CJ Stroud trusts him. It's the rest of the season. It could be unreal. And then he gets Baltimore in that championship game.
Yeah.
I mean,
that could be a full burger right there.
He could win you the championship in 1 week. I know it's Miami, Kansas City before that, but I don't know. I think when Nico and CJ Stroud are on that field together, they feel about as matchup proof as you get for a duo right now. So I get it. Because I understand the upside. It's just for him to pay off here. If you knew you were going to miss 4 weeks, he has to average 20 plus rest of the season. If he does, the 4 weeks is forgivable. That's just why I knocked him. But I don't hate it here either, because I've been struggling, and the two wide receivers I had ahead of him have missed 2+ games too. So it's like
totally.
It's a really difficult one. But yeah, what we've seen this year has been just unreal from him.
So, okay. So you said the other 2 wide receivers you had ahead of him also. Oh boy. So I think I'm going to be really interested to see where you two have this player. Because I do have another player ahead of probably the 2 that you're talking about, Cameron. My pick here at 12 is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Okay.
And I get it. You could look. My guess is that the other 2 players ahead of him were going to be AJ Brown and Malik Nabers. This is the tier I had the most difficult time ranking.
Mm-hmm. It's gross right
once you got to Jahmyr Gibbs,
that's gross.
Everything after it's not gross, but everything after this is like, I could make a case for almost any single one of you to be this 12th pick. You could make it a Joe Mixon, who's been on fire. You could make it a Breece Hall, who, has had a few down games, but overall has still been phenomenal this year and has been at one of the healthiest positions in fantasy football this year, ironically. The reason why I'm going with Amon-Ra here is that his average this year is just weighted down by 2 bad games. That is all this is. You look at Amon-Ra's game log. It was 4.3 in week 1 and 8.7 this last week. Otherwise, this dude has been giving you 20+ points every single week outside of week 6, where I gave you 13.7, but 22.9, 20.5, 20.8. They go into the bye week. 25.2 he gives you. So this is a guy who can still very clearly get it done, who I think is on the best offense in the league. I'm just going to go there and say that. Again, can I survive without 2 weeks of AJ Brown and Malik Nabers? Probably. Would I rather have the points Amon-Ra gave me and just deal with the week 1 stinker when everybody's still trying to figure it out? Like, that's what it kind of came down to for me. So I get if you want to have guys like AJ Brown, Malik Nabers ahead of Amon-Ra. Again, I had the most difficult time trying to place Amon-Ra in here. I did put him ahead of AJ Brown and Malik Nabers, and it was simply because Amon-Ra has been around longer than those 2 outside of his bye week. So that's the only reason why I'm going Amon-Ra here. But you 2 could push back and totally say it should be AJ Brown and Malik Nabers, and I would probably say I don't disagree with you to any extent.
You can't hate on it, right? It's Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's going to put up points. Rest of the season's probably going to look really well. The only thing that worries about me is this offense has shown it doesn't need him. Sure. They're still going to use him. Obviously, he's still been productive. He still has a touchdown in 5 straight weeks. But they've shown like, hey, we could throw it to Tim Patrick and Penny Sewell, right? Like we could do stupid stuff and win by 30. So that's the only thing that concerns me. And looking at it, I think the recency bias of him going 2 targets for 2 receptions to 7 yards and a touchdown moved him down. I think if we do this last week, I think he's probably ahead of him for me. So I'm going to take that into account. He was my player 16.
Sure.
So like you said, for me, I hit Gibbs at 6. 7 through 20 was a tier for me, and I can kind of go in any order with them. So obviously you can't hate on it here. I just was a little bit lower, but like you said, I feel like you're probably going to end up being right about him higher than Malik and AJ Brown rest of the season.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been surprised if you 2 had him outside of the top 15, because I keep going down this list and I'm like, man, I really could put Amon-Ra behind any of these dudes. Was he inside your top 15, Ty, or was he outside?
He snuck in. He was my number 14 guy.
Sure.
And for the exact same reason that Cam mentioned, of just like the entry for Amon-Ra going into the season was because like you knew he was the guy.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, this Detroit offense is willing to just kind of do what they want whenever they want. Now that we're seeing, 4.3 and 8.7, again, we do need to put those games into context a little bit. But again, for what we had saw last year from Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? For the fact that he was a top 6 pick in most drafts this year because he's putting up games with like 15 and 19, 11 and 14, and he's consistently scoring you 20 points. He has kind of done that this year, but again, it feels like the kind of the lock that he was last year isn't so much of a lock this year. It's still there, but that there's just a lower floor this year than in years past.
Which none of us thought of coming into the year, but yeah, we also know the upside is like a cool 20 points per game. Like nothing has ever changed for this offense either. So I don't disagree with both of you having him lower. It just really came down to how much do I weigh these injuries and the outlook rest of season as well. So let's wrap up this final round because I've probably mentioned all 3 players that are going to go in this final round. It'll just depend on what order they go in. So Cameron, I'll come to you here. Who's pick number 13?
We have not even discussed. We've not even in the atmosphere of this player. It's George Kittle. It's George Kittle. Oh. He was my player 8. And here's why. Here's why. He's averaging since week 1. Week 1 was gross. 19.5 points per game is what he's averaging right now. Next closest is Brock Bowers at 15. He is putting up Travis Kelce numbers currently from his prime, and there is no Brandon Ayuk rest of the season. I understand CMC's coming back, but there is no Ayuk. He is the number 1 option right now in this offense, and he's right now 6 touchdowns in 7 games played. He's scoring touchdowns. He's had over the last 4 weeks 64, 58, 92, 128 yards. Seen 12, 6, 7, 7 targets. I understand Christian McCaffrey's coming back now. But with no Brandon Ayuk, I think it's just been the perfect storm for him. You have no CMC first half of the season, no Brandon Ayuk second half. I think he's going to continue to put up insane points. And for me, what really did it is the way the rest of the tight ends look.
Yes.
Because you don't trust any of them. They've all had good weeks, good moments, right? Kelsey's been decent recently. Pitts was just good. Bowers is probably the only guy who's been comparable. But George Kittle is the positional advantage right now, averaging 4 points per game more than any other tight end. I think that's first round worthy, and I don't think it's stopping.
I debated George Kittle so heavily when making my rankings. He just missed out on my top 15. But if there was ever a year where you could pinpoint positional advantage and which guy it's going to be, it would be this year. Because you would be dominating your league mates with this positional advantage right now in George Kittle. So like I don't hate that pick whatsoever, especially from a fantasy point per game perspective. He's averaging 18 fantasy points per game, man. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Ty, you're a little bit shocked. Did you have George Kittle in your player list at all?
He was my number 19 guy, so kind of in that range of honorable mention guys. But again, like, can't argue with what he's been doing. You take his points per game and look at wide receivers, he would be the wide receiver 9 in points per game.
Yep.
He has more points per game than Amon-Ra St. Brown, the guy that you just took, Lucas.
Yep.
Yeah, again, knowing if you knew at the beginning of the year how gross tight ends would look, Kittle's value would have skyrocketed in the middle of July.
Yeah. And drafters wouldn't have regretted it. Because especially if you knew Ayuk was going to get injured for the second half of the season. I mean, that's the part that's even crazier about this is he's been great, with Ayuk struggling, but now you just remove that element entirely and it could be the George Kittle show rest of the season.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we talk about the guy who might be fantasy MVP at the end of the year. For me, he's leading that race because, like I said, Brock Bowers is at 14. Trey McBride's at 13. There is no other tight end averaging over 12 fantasy points per game on the season right now. That's a 6-point advantage every single week over like 80% of your league mates. That's just crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's nuts.
Oh, and what's crazy, yes, it's from a points per game basis, it's 6 more points, but what's crazy is that it might range to 12. It might be 6 to 12, depending on, it might be 18. If it's Mark Andrews,
Yeah.
weeks 3 through 5, right? Like it's just absolutely crazy what George Kittle has been able to accomplish this year. And what's crazier is that it still might be up from here. Ty, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to you for pick 14 here. I'm going to be surprised if you don't take one of the next 2 highest ranked players on my board.
So I'm having this internal debate of like, do I want to go with the other onesie position here with this guy because he has been doing so well? I'm not going to, but hey, I just want to point out Lamar Jackson putting up 25 points a game. I mean,
he's been crushing it. He really has.
Again, we are not fans of taking quarterbacks early. Like second round quarterbacks are definitely a pass for us, but hey, Lamar Jackson is definitely making a case to be a worthy second round pick. That being said, though, I am going to go with Joe Mixon here.
Oh, not who I was expecting.
Next highest player on my list.
Because it was between 2 running backs for me. Mixon, obviously, and I'm not going to spoil the next guy because maybe you do take him next. Because the other guy has a ceiling week to week that just is not matched. You can't match it, right? But for Mixon himself, the injury sucks. Again, this is a very similar one to Nico. The injury sucks because you're missing 3.5 games of Joe Mixon this year.
Yeah.
But in all the games that he has played, he's put up over 21 points a game.
Yeah.
Like he's got 3 games with at least 25 carries.
Yeah.
Like you are not getting that kind of workload, that kind of volume anywhere else. And again, the only reason why he dropped this far in this redraft is because of the injury.
Yeah.
Had he stayed healthy, Mixon might have been a top 5 pick. I push top 3. Like, because again, for how well he's been producing and nearly putting up a touchdown per game at this point, like I can't pass up Mixon at this point.
No, so what's crazy about all of this is that, we're all like, oh, CJ Stroud and Nico Collins. But it's like Joe Mixon, man, what this offense has been just stupid how they've gone from like, watch CJ Stroud chuck the ball around the yard to watch us run the ball nonstop behind a struggling offensive line. Like, I don't quite understand what's going on. But Joe Mixon is getting fed and he's giving you the volume and he's scoring on top of it. It's like, you're 100% right. If he didn't miss those 3 games, Ty, we're talking about him as a top 5 pick here, no question. So Ty, Cameron, he was your next highest player. Yep. Where was he at for you?
He was at 10 for me. And like you said, if he does it, he would miss Minnesota, which would have been a tough matchup, but then Jacksonville and Buffalo. If you don't think he's going to score 25 plus against Jacksonville and Buffalo, you're crazy. I mean, he would have put up crazy points on those 2. But yeah, he's averaging 22 fantasy points per game right now. And the thing for Mixon is he's always just been a volume guy. He's never been efficient. He's averaging 5 yards a tote right now.
Yeah.
He's averaging, like you said, he's got 6 touchdowns in 5 games. And then he's averaging 5.5 points through the receiving points per game on top of it all. It's just, I don't see them not using him less, especially with Diggs out now. He goes, the Jets, Detroit, you probably can't. But then, against Miami, Kansas City, and Baltimore, obviously not a great matchup, but Kansas City and Miami, you're going to want to run the ball. And even Baltimore, you're going to want to try to run the ball because you don't want any of those offenses on the field. So I don't know. I think he's going to just see insane volume and he's been efficient doing it. So yeah, I agree. I think Mixon doesn't have that injury. We're talking about him. I'm talking about the same. We're talking about Kyren Williams right now.
No, 100%. I just cannot believe. I just can't believe Bobby Slowick has just changed his MO entirely. When you go out and get Stephon Diggs, you go out and you still have Nico Collins and you have Tank Dell, who was great last year, and you just flip your MO entirely. And it's like, I don't care how bad our offensive line is. We're just going to run the ball. Mm-hmm. I get Nico's been great, but this offensive line has not been great from a run blocking perspective. Yet Joe Mixon has been this dominant. So I don't blame you both for having him that high. I'll go ahead and I'll wrap out the draft here. What, you were gonna laugh? What are you laughing about?
You were talking about how dominant Joe Mixon is. Have you seen how much that's affected CJ Stroud?
By quite a bit.
Quarterback 23 in points per game right now.
There's a reason.
He's barely even startable in 2 quarterback leagues because they're running the ball so much. That's crazy. All right, you can go on to your next guy.
I was going to say that will bring up the point of like, yes, we expected regression from CJ Stroud. I'll pat ourselves on the back for that one.
Wow.
Was not by the means that we expected though, that Bobby Slowick was just going to change the MO of this offense entirely.
Oh man. Crazy.
Last pick. I would be surprised if you both disagreed with me here. I'm going to take Malik Nabers. Yep. And this is like, it's between him, AJ Brown, and Amon-Ra were the 3 that I was so struggling with. And it was like, give me points to Amon-Ra because he's played more games. But like Malik Nabers, man, outside of 11.6 in week 1 and 8 against Philly this last week, where he still drew 8 targets, mind you. How about 28.7, 28.2, 23.1 with 12 plus targets in all those games? 18, 15, and 12 targets in those games. Then you look at his schedule rest of season. Oh my gosh. If this man doesn't average 20 fantasy points the rest of the season, I can't say he won't average 20 rest of the season. But when after week 8 against Pittsburgh here, which is, you'll listen to this after that game, Washington, Carolina, bye week, Tampa Bay, Dallas, New Orleans, Baltimore, Atlanta, Indianapolis. Malik Nabers could draw 12 plus targets in all of those games. And I get we hate the offense. I get we hate Daniel Jones. What's stopping Brian Dable from just scheming up Malik Nabers 13, 14 targets a game and just voluming his way to 20 plus in each of those games? I mean, when you were talking about a cakewalk rest of season, Malik Nabers is the definition of that. So if he struggles against Pittsburgh, again, recording this 3 p.m. on Monday, October 28th, if he struggles against Pittsburgh tonight, I am selling the farm to go out and get Malik Nabers rest of season because frankly, I think 15 might be too low. He probably should have been my pick at 12, but again, weighing early season versus missed time to now late season, it becomes a blur, but Malik Nabers here, I think, has to round out the top 15.
Yeah, I really like him here. I know Ty had another guy here that he thinks should be in the top 15. But I think I agree because the volume's just been so crazy, and I think it's just going to keep up because it's him and Wan'Dale Robinson. And if I'm choosing between those two, I think I'm going to pick Malik Nabers 9 times out of 10 when I have the ability to. So I think it's going to be gross, but I think the volume's going to just inflate his numbers so much that you just can't keep him outside the top 15 players the rest of the season.
Let's launch into a quick list of honorable mentions. So we'll start with you, Ty, because you said you had one player in here for sure that you had ahead of Malik Nabers. And we can keep this short. We don't need to go on wide analysis here, but let's just each throw out a couple more names that we had on our list.
AJ Brown.
Yep, he was the one I was debating between.
Devon Achane.
Achane's a fascinating one. Yeah.
So I struggled a lot with Achane.
I did
because
too.
Because if we're talking rest of the season, it could be insane, right? Same with Tyreek. I struggle with both of them.
Yeah.
But just the down weeks you had there were rough.
And Tyreek.
Yeah.
Because for literally the same reason as Achane.
Yeah.
Those were the most difficult ones. Because early season they've burned you so bad. Could they win you a league second half of the season? Absolutely. But man, if you knew that's what you were getting the first 8 weeks of the season, you couldn't justify taking them with the top 15 pick. You just couldn't. Mm-hmm. Who else was on your list for you, Cameron?
Brees had to be there.
Yep.
I mean, obviously weeks 4, 5 stunk. Last week stunk. But he's put up 24, 21, 26 in games, 2 18-point games. It's just, I'm just worried about what this Jets offense looks like rest of the season because they've been so dumpster fire, and I could just see Aaron Rodgers quitting halfway through the rest of the season. So I'm just like, I don't know. And then Braylon Allen, is just steals touchdowns, but the receiving work's been insane. So I think he's worthy of this bubble. Like Tyler said, I had Lamar Jackson.
Yep.
In this range too. I had him at 20. And then I think Jonathan Taylor and Drake London as well. I think we're close, but for me, they weren't really in the conversation because I think the top 15, right? I think that they're just outside of that conversation for me.
Yeah, Drake London was the one I wanted to make sure we mentioned because I don't think we're giving this dude his flowers after everybody dogged him after week 1 where he only had 3.5 points. I mean, outside, again, recency bias, if we really want to lean into that against Tampa this last week, obviously it wasn't great, 7.4 points, but 17, 18.7, 33.4, 19.4, 18.3. I mean, he's drawn 8 plus targets in the majority of those games. He's scoring touchdowns.
Yeah.
There's only been 3 games where Drake London hasn't scored a touchdown this year. So, yeah, I think we got to make sure Drake London gets his flowers here. I don't know if he's top 15, but, a very real possibility that Drake London rest of season actually performs at a top 10 level, despite what people wanted to dog him for at the start of the season. So, again, I mentioned it with Bijan. This Atlanta offense is finally figuring it out. Feed your best guys. Why are we overcomplicating this? And guess what? It's working. Like crazy how that works. We'll wrap it up there, fellas. Make sure you follow us on the socials as well to get all of our fantasy football NFL reactions as well. I'm at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, CamLawFFF for Cameron, Tyler _Plath for Tyler. Make sure you follow the fellas accounts as well. FFFellas on Twitter, DFFfellas on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on Facebook and TikTok. Make sure you subscribe here to get all of our newest content. Turn on that notification bell as well so you know when all of our newest episodes are out. Ty and Cam will be back tomorrow with some trade targets, and then all three of us will be back later in the week for 24 different players who will change the outcome of your week 9 matchups for fantasy football. Till we see you all next time, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.
Deuces.